So we would like to continue with our second talk by Christina Currie. And Christina Currie, she's the head of scientific imagery at the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage, KIK-IRPA in Brussels. And you have been specialized in the technical examination of paintings, and her main field of research is the Bruegel family. Mainly, her main focus is on Peter Bruegel the Elder and Peter Bruegel the Younger, but also copies by Jan Bruegel the Elder. So since 20 years, we just discussed it recently, not recently, just this afternoon. You have been really examining the work by Peter Bruegel very closely. And actually, you have been here 20 years before, and it was Christina Currie who discovered that our painting, it's not dated on 1567, but it must be read, the signature must be read as 1563. And besides really focusing on Peter Bruegel, you have also been active in the Van Eyck research project and the open access that's now also online. You can also check it online, and also involved in the main exhibition that just started in Ghent recently. And again, I'm so happy that you are here, and thank you very much.
Very much for that kind introduction. Very kind. So, Dominique has now set the scene for you and set the painting in its art historical context. And I will now delve a little deeper into some of the main issues that have preoccupied us about this painting. And I'll be looking at three main questions. So the first one I'll tackle is, how do we really know that this painting is the original one, given the large number of copies? So can we prove it actually? Can we prove it scientifically, technically, and stylistically? The second question is about Bruegel's artistry and how he did it. When you look at the adoration, you got the impression that he must have been out there in the snow somehow with his easel, observing those snowflakes, just painting it as if it was from the life. But actually, Dominique and I have found out over the years that he was an inveterate planner. He didn't just do anything off the cuff. He did immense amounts of preparatory drawings and things, which is the artifice, in fact, is all hidden. It's all behind the scenes. We don't see that. So I will be examining that a bit. Then thirdly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the copies. How did they teach us more about the original version? And in fact, it's surprising how much they teach you about how Bruegel the Elder worked. So let's first consider the painting's authenticity. As I said, how do we know? We've got this amazing, there's a photograph of a very, very close copy in the exhibition. How do we know it's not another version by Bruegel or the original? Then you've got all these other copies by Bruegel the Younger. In fact, there are 26 of them known. I say they're by Bruegel, and yet how do we know that? And when I was searching for this lecture, I was researching this lecture, I found this on the internet. So, is this correct? No, obviously not. You can see that. So somebody has just mistaken it and put this online as if that's the original. Well, it's not. Because it's so difficult, really, for people. They don't know, really, Bruegel's style. So back to the original painting. It may be a work of genius, but actually, first and foremost, it's a plank of wood with some paint on it. And it's admittedly the finest oak that the artist could find, but it's a piece of wood nevertheless. And that means we can start to try to look more into the wood by a process we call dendrochronology. And this tells you more about the wood itself and its date. And dendrochronology was done by my colleague at the KIK-IRPA called Pascale Freiture. There's Pascale doing her examination. And she's done so many Bruegels now that she has a large database of if you like, dendrochronological data on Bruegel. And as luck may have it, she's collaborated with Ian Tyers in England on 2 other paintings by Bruegel. And they found out together that these paintings, so the Return on the Flight to Egypt, painted the same year as the Adoration, the Death of the Virgin, painted a couple of years later, we're not quite sure the date, and the Winter Landscape with Bird Trap, that all these panels are painted on planks from the self-same tree. That's kind of interesting. So this tree, in fact, it came from, in those days, the best source for wood was the Baltic region. And this tree came from the Eastern Baltic region. And why it came from that region is because the trees were growing in very densely occupied forests, and they were close together. They grew very tall, straight, they searched for the light, and it was cold, so they grew slowly, producing planks that were extremely stable over time. And in addition to this, the Adoration and the others have the best cuts of wood, which means they're radial cuts, quarter cut wood. They don't warp on aging. So Bruegel, in fact, this painting was done on one of the best planks possible. Interestingly, we could date these, because they're all planks from the same tree. To date the actual wood, you just need to find this tree ring. That's the youngest. So the youngest tree ring, in fact, came from the Winter Landscape with Bird Trap, and that was dated 1551. And unusually, there are a few sapwood rings, which normally is cut off by artists because it's sort of very attractive to insects. And if the minimum number of sapwood rings for the Baltic region is 6, and there were 4 sapwood rings on this panel, so we just add 2 for the possible missing ones. So we get to the earliest possible felling date, which is 1553. Then, of course, the panel had to be transported to Belgium, when the Low Countries in those days, and there was a bit of seasoning. But it does mean that this tree, if you like, was suitable for all these paintings. Looking at their date, there's no sort of question there about the possibility that they could be by Bruegel. So another thing interesting is, if you noticed here, is if you notice that the Adoration is actually slightly less tall than the others. So it could suggest that the Adoration has lost a little bit at the top. And in fact, across that top edge, it is more smooth and it does look like it's cut down slightly. And supporting that even further is this other copy, which you have in the exhibition in photography, which shows more room at the top. So I'll be coming to that later, back to that question later of the other painting and what it shows you about the original, how it was. However, although the wood is clearly, it suggests that it's done in the same studio, that it's part of Bruegel's studio, a panel maker in those days, probably Bruegel used a panel maker, could have supplied different studios. So the fact it's on this particular plank from the same tree as the others is not in itself a sign that it's authentically Bruegel's hand. So let's look at a few more signs that it's Bruegel's hand. First of all, we've got this. And now, Dominique discussed this slightly. At the back, you have this inscription, handwritten, which is actually the number 243, which is the inventory number from the banker Everard Jabak's death inventory. And this was drawn up on the 17th of July, 1693, which is some 133 years after the painting was painted. And so you say, is it really that inventory? Well, the inventory itself says it was a winter scene with many figures, 3 kings worshipping, our Lord in the foreground, heavy snow is falling, and a small child on the ice in a small sled. Bruegel the elder, £15. So the fact that we know the number of the inventory and the numbers written on the back does suggest that it's this painting. And the person who wrote the inventory clearly thought it was Bruegel, so it was common knowledge at the time that it was Bruegel. What we don't know is, of course, is where Jabak got it from and who was the original patron, who commissioned it. So let's now turn to the front. And there's yet another sign that it's Bruegel, of course, the signature, but it's quite interesting, the signature. We'll go right close. It's a bit abraded over time, unfortunately, but we can still see just, if you look very carefully, that the ones for the date are dotted. And I suppose I know that because I've seen them on other paintings, because it really is difficult to see on this one. But we'll go and look at the others. So the De la Griet, which is a wonderful painting in the Meyer van der Berg collection in Antwerp, is actually dated the same year. This was the year 1563, the year of Bruegel's marriage. It was an important year. He produced a lot that year. And this one shows these dots on the ones. Then you've got the Adoration of the Magi in London, the one that Dominique showed, which is vertical format. Also, these little ones are dotted. You've got the Sermon of St. John the Baptist signature, which is actually 66, that's dotted. And finally, one dated the Parable of the Blind from 1568. So this little idiosyncrasy in the signature is like kind of typical of Bruegel. So it, again, supports the originality of our painting. However, any connoisseur will tell you the only real way to tell whether something's by an artist is to actually look at this painterly style and to compare its brushwork. And Dominique's done a little bit of this, and I'm just going to give you a visual treat, and you're going to see that it conforms perfectly to the style we see in his other paintings. So this wonderful tracery of tree branches at the top does recall the winter landscape with the bird trap painted a couple of years later. Even though there's no actively falling snow, you can see the resemblance. And then in this one, I'll draw your attention to the snow on the posts at the back there, which sticks out from the surface. And also, very difficult to see, but there are little blue icicles hanging down from the rooftop. And then you can see these kind of anonymous, sort of brushy figures. They're brushed in sort of black paint, these figures at the back. I noticed that at the back of Bruegel's paintings, these figures, they generally are turning their backs to you. They're going about their business. And in this case, they're slightly faded because they're slightly abraded, I think. Now, if you look at the winter landscape with bird trap, you see the same sort of phenomenon. These posts with their snow on top of them. You see these little icicles hanging down, and you see these anonymous figures, turning their backs to you on their way. And then we've got what Dominique describes as the barely visible. So we have to assume these are figures back here. He's hardly drawn them. You see them again in the Hunters in the Snow. We can zoom in a bit. And you see it in both cases, you've just got the head painted. The rest of the body is actually just suggested, and it's covered in something like smoke or whatever. Again, you can see that a little bit at the back of the censers at Bethlehem, these sort of shadowy figures behind the tax collector. It kind of recalls a little bit the shadowy figures in the Adoration, although it's on a slightly larger scale, so they're slightly more defined. And then you've got, of course, the way that Bruegel painted these little children sledding on the ice. Here we are, let's go in a bit closer. He used kind of single colours, quite bold and opaque, and it's entirely characteristic of his style. The census is obviously a slightly larger scale, so there's a little bit more detail, but it's the same sort of way of treating the brushwork. And then you've got the fact that in many paintings of snow particularly, he comes back later and he puts thicker snow on either around the figures or on their hats, and in the same way the snowballs and the census you see there as well. They've got snow on their clothing where they've thrown snowballs, and they've also got it, they're throwing the snowballs. And again, as I was saying, these shadowy figures in dark clothing at the back of paintings. Here again in the Hunters in the Snow, the same sort of gestures, they're all hunched up and dark and there's not much detail. But you see exactly what they're doing. And then Bruegel also, I mean, people have noticed he's got a predilection for these holes in the ice, and as Dominique explained, they can be a sort of sign of the fragility of life and human existence and how it can be cut off at any one moment. And you see these holes, if you look at if you start to examine winter landscapes by Bruegel, you can generally find a hole somewhere in the ice. And I know that the holes were made in order to be able to take water to drink, but there was obviously more to it in Bruegel's mind. If you look right at the back of this engraving, there's somebody falling through the ice, and that was done before the Adoration. And it's also the way he painted these holes in the ice, kind of with the brushy strokes. In the winter landscape with bird trap, also he's used his thumb or finger to take off some material. You can see his print. So just if you want to know further, you've probably all been on this website to look at the details from this painting. If you haven't seen it, though, the Inside Bruegel, you look at the little snowflake, and then you've got that, but it's in the exhibition. You've all seen that. So I'm now going to consider the actual technique of this painting a little bit more on the basis of what we can see through this wonderful new scientific imagery. And we'll start by looking at how the panel was made. So you've got a wooden panel, and on the panel there would have been he would have prepared it with a white chalk ground, and you see that a little bit on the edge where there's a damage. Unfortunately, damages are very useful for working out technique. On top of that white ground, he would have painted, it would have been chalk mixed with animal glue. On top there would be an oil layer, just to seal the ground before painting. And the oil layer, in Bruegel's case, the priming layer would have been just white. So it would have continued, if you like, the colour of the ground. And that would seal it. And in fact, he's left, as you can see here, he's left a kind of reserve, if you like, in the snow paint, showing the priming layer for his signature. And he often did give spaces for his signature. He's one of those artists, the few artists that actually signed his paintings during that period. So what did he, on this priming layer, he would then have done a preliminary drawing. And you can probably see just in white, I've highlighted where that preliminary drawing is visible in infrared. And we can see it a little bit here, for instance, in normal light. So you can see there, it's actually done in probably black chalk, which is a material most artists used for drawing in those days. I've got some at the back there, you can see afterwards. And here you can see a branch, for instance, he's drawn, he hasn't actually carried it through to paint. You can also see a little bit of drawing here, where the arch has been drawn, it overshoots slightly into the canal. And then here, I think on the wall, there's a kind of round shape, which could be kind of mooring ring, which he decided not to paint, I'm guessing. So if anybody has another idea about what this could be, I'd like to hear it. However, in the main body of figures in the center, I scoured this for hours and hours, and in normal light, infrared light, whatever, I don't find any trace of drawing whatsoever. And this is kind of interesting, because it's unlike some other paintings by Bruegel, where there is more drawing elsewhere. I think this was actually painted in by Bruegel, following a preliminary drawing. And he just was such an excellent draftsman, he didn't need, in this case, to do an underdrawing. And this is what distinguishes the original version, we're sure of it now, from the copies. Because if you look at any of the copies in infrared, you will see a very detailed underdrawing underneath, because they would have needed that. Whereas he could do it based on a model drawing, and I will come back to the question of the model drawing later. But that is why it's almost disappointing in infrared, because we can't find this drawing, and we're searching for it, can't find it. There is none in this place. So moving up to the paint layer, what we have to help us work out the order of the painting is X-radiography and infrared reflectography. So this is the X-radiograph. It's kind of difficult to read when you first see it. We'll zoom in here to this part, and that's the same area in normal light. So what you see that everything that's white on an X-ray, in general, is lead white based. And in those days, the main pigment, white pigment, was lead white. And we can see that, in fact, he painted the snowy rooftop there in lead white based paint, leaving a gap for this tree on the right, because it's less white in the X-ray. However, for the tree just to the left of it, he's painted that directly on top of the rooftop, because there's no, what we call, a reserve for it. So although Bruegel he knew what he was going to paint, he didn't always reserve his forms. Sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. I'm going to show you a couple more. In the copies, on the other hand, they're much more regular and systematic, and usually there's a reserve for every single feature. Let's just go down here. So this, in the Holy Family, in the corner, I can show you an infrared image of this. If he'd painted the background paint first, which is this brushy black color, and then he painted on the figures, we almost wouldn't see them today. because over time, oil paint becomes slightly more transparent, so the background color becomes more dominant. So the fact here is actually painted as background, leaving gaps for the figures is a good thing, because now we can still see them, and they're much more evident. Whereas in this detail, for instance, you can see these two figures here have actually been painted directly on the sort of dark brickwork behind, and the figures themselves are merging slightly into the brickwork because they have become slightly more transparent over time. Here it's interesting. I think, so these figures in the middle, he just painted on overlapping, for instance. The one at the back is overlapping the wall, and the one in the middle is overlapping the mural, if you like. And you can see the difference between where they overlap the snow, they're very bright, and where they overlap something that's dark, they're dark. I don't think Bruegel initially intended that to be the case. I think it's just over time that the paint, the black paint, has become slightly more transparent. So when we're talking about him painting, he'd obviously almost finished, and then he came back with a loaded brush and painted these thick sort of snow elements around, these sort of wedges of snow around. And I zoom in here, you can see just there, for instance, that the snow paint kind of overlaps slightly the dark paint behind, proving it was put on last. And then, of course, you've got the dusting of fresh snow on the hats, which is kind of put on late, and on shoulders. And then here as well, it's quite interesting. If you look just here, he's obviously, the leg of this guy was slightly sticking out, and he's corrected it by putting some snow paint on top. And then, of course, you've got these wonderful snowflakes, which we never tire of seeing, which are last minute and last touch. And now, just before I turn to the question of the models and the copies, the model drawing and the copies, I'd just like to address the question of condition. I have mentioned that, yes, oil paint becomes more transparent, so what we're seeing is a slightly more translucent painting, and this was the case for most of Bruegel's paintings, in fact. They are more translucent than they were originally. But there are a few other things that have changed, and what's very useful with this is to look at this. Well, here, we'll show that just. So we've got this roof door, sort of makeshift rooftop, if you like, over the fire, which seems to be faded away, if you like. And we've also got these two figures that are extremely sort of difficult to see, and this one at the back. I think that's because, I personally think that's abrasion damage with sort of somebody slightly enthusiastically cleaning the painting at some stage, personally. However, with this other copy that you've got a photograph of in the exhibition, it shows you how I believe Bruegel wanted it in the beginning. So this copy, it's one of the only two faithful, really faithful copies of the painting. It was most likely done from the original version at a very early stage, and you've got, basically, it bears witness to how Bruegel wanted his painting to be, without, of course, imitating his wonderful brushwork. You're probably wondering, is it just a second version by Bruegel? Before I move on, I'm just going to read you something written by Kirsten Richter. She wrote this about this painting, and this says, the difference really between the copy and the original, she says, the colours of, the overall impression left by this panel is tidier, outlines are sharper, the execution is more that of a draftsman than of a painter. This is particularly evident in the rendering of the faces and hair of the figures directly involved in the adoration scene. Whereas these are indicated in the original with just a few brush strokes, in the copy they are more precise, which makes them appear less spontaneous and detracts from the painterly qualities. There is also a difference in the aggregate state of the snowflakes in the original and in this version. Whereas the former dance down from the sky in thick, compact flurries, in this copy they appear to be floating to the ground in a more restrained, more organized manner. I like that description. I couldn't do it better, so I thought I'd read that for you. So there's another thing interesting about, so this, as I said, this painting is very interesting because it bears witness to how the original must have been. And let's look a little bit down in this corner. Normally, the Virgin's robe is normally blue. In the copies by Bruegel the Younger, in fact, the Virgin's robe is blue. And in this, it's this kind of sludgy colour. Now, in this copy, which is anonymous, it's kind of greyish. And let's zoom in a little bit more. And they both have this sort of glassy look to them. And in fact, what I think is that this pigment was in fact blue, and it's a blue pigment called smalt, which is a cobalt-based glass pigment. Bruegel used it very frequently in his paintings, and we see some of them, we see this effect in many paintings where the blue has simply become translucent and lost its colour. And in the copy here, I think that copyist did use the same pigment. I haven't analysed it, obviously, chemically, but it's gone greyish instead of losing its colour completely. And we've got one more thing that's interesting with this copy. This is Balthazar. You all had a look, perhaps, at Balthazar. And the copyist has made him slightly more explicit, so we can actually see what's happening. He's carrying this cup, and you can almost see the frankincense that he's offering to Jesus. And his whole figure is actually slightly more explicit. Now, whether or not Bruegel painted him slightly more clearly at the beginning, we can't really know. But anyway, he's slightly more clear in the copy. And there's one more motif like that that's quite fun. This is the head of the mule. And in the original, you can't see that there was this kind of little flower pattern and with this kind of muzzle. But so the question is, I think Bruegel probably hinted at these patterns in his painting, and the copyist made them more explicit. And now we just don't see them at all in the original. So the copy does give us perhaps some inkling of what Bruegel originally wanted, perhaps. The other thing, of course, and I mentioned that at the beginning, is the format. So the copyist, I believe, copied what he saw. So we actually see here Bruegel's original composition. And to me, it's slightly more balanced, because you've got this, this ruined kind of chateau at the right, the castle, with this black brick in part. And it sort of, to me, it balances the sort of very dark interior of the stable at the lower left. And when you sort of look at the other painting, the original, it doesn't have that counterbalance of the dark tonality. And of course, it's much nicer to see the trees going on a little bit at the top. They're slightly sort of cropped in the original version nowadays. So it does bear witness to how the original must have looked. So, as I mentioned earlier, I've been mentioning all along, Bruegel must have planned this painting very carefully, but not one of his model drawings for paintings survives. And Dominique and I have spent years working out how his model drawings must have looked, and this treasure trove of model drawings was most likely handed down to his eldest son. And in those days, artists tend to sort of hand down all their studio materials and possessions and drawings to their eldest child, who would often become an artist as well. So this is what we think. And we've got the evidence for this model drawing in the son's copies, in fact. And you will see this in just a minute. And as I said, how we work it out is we play the game of spot the difference. It's all quite fun. So I'm going to take two copies. This is the copy in the Museum of the Royal Museums of Fine Arts in Brussels, and the copy in Antwerp in Royal Museum of Fine Arts. And these are the two copies I studied for my PhD, so I know them very well. First of all, just to compare the signatures, these two have typical signatures of Bruegel the Younger. He signed his paintings. He didn't try to fake his father's works. He signed them with a signature with a different spelling to his father. And you can't really see, unfortunately, in the original because it's abraded. But after the G, there's an H in Bruegel the Younger's copies. And there's one other little feature here that's kind of curious, is that it's B-R-E-U, G-H-E-L. And Bruegel the other, it's B-R-U-E. Bruegel the Younger signed his paintings B-R-U-E up to 1616, and then he's changed the signature and signed them B-R-E-U. So we know, even though these paintings are not dated, we know they're 1616 or later. So, little fact. There's one thing you may have noticed in the original, with all its heavy snow: not a single bird. In the copies, he's put birds everywhere. Bruegel the Younger. In fact, I challenge you to find a bird in the original, if you've all looked carefully. Katja and I noticed that there was one bird in that close faithful copy. And that is, we're both of us wondering why there's one bird in the faithful copy, because if he's a faithful copy, why would he put the bird in? And I actually have my suspicions that it may well be a retouching, but I can't prove it because I haven't examined the painting. But that is one big difference between copy and original, is that there are lots of birds. And it makes sense if Bruegel the Younger had a model drawing and didn't see the final painting, that he might have put birds in. He didn't see the snow, he put birds in. Why would birds be flying around in heavy snow? Then it's unlikely to find a bird in Bruegel the Elder's painting. But if it's a calm day and the snow has fallen, then the birds come out again. So the Bruegel the Younger, probably having not seen the original, put birds in. Have you noticed perhaps already the difference in the colour scheme between the copy and the original? In the original, everything, if there's a colour, there's just a hint of it. Just a hint, and it's very subtle and very nuanced. Not the case in the copies. They are bright, joyful, very anecdotal. In fact, you recognise here immediately the typical costume of the Landsknecht soldiers, the mercenary soldiers that served armies all through the 16th century and 15th century even. And they're present in every copy by Bruegel the Younger, and they always show the same colours. Same goes when you look at the fire. These wonderful, nuanced, barely visible figures in Bruegel the Elder are replaced by these very bright, joyful figures. You can see all their hands warming them up in front of the fire in Bruegel the Younger. This is quite different. Everything becomes more explicit, and some of that sort of nuanced, dark meaning kind of disappears. These are more joyful paintings. Then you've got the little girl on the sled. Here we are. As you can see, they both share the same colour for the top part of the dress, but the little apron is white in the copies. And then you've got this interesting figure, these two figures, which were present in the very faithful copy, but they're not present in a single copy by Bruegel the Younger. I'm just showing them where they are in the faithful copy, which probably means Bruegel the Younger never actually saw the original painting. And you look at the back of the painting. Now there's soldiers at the back kind of sort of looking on with a cart with one wheel in the original. And quite a lot of, I've read in various art historians, they interpret this wheel as a kind of allusion to the Wheel of Fortune and the change from basically pagan to Christian existence. So Bruegel maybe meant something by this wheel, and you see a wheel in the sense of the Bethlehem right in the middle as well, and that has also been considered perhaps a little allusion to the Wheel of Fortune. Bruegel the Younger put two wheels. So, that's gone, that illusion. We don't quite know what was in the model drawing, but maybe Bruegel the Younger thought it's more logical for a cart to have two wheels, so he put two. We've also got the dog. He's a different breed in the copies. And that's the case in quite a number of paintings where we consider that Bruegel the Younger probably based his copies on drawings rather than the final painting. However, there are some colours that correspond, and here we are. And so what we can imagine is that this lost model drawing probably had one or two colour notes on it saying, these have got red breeches. So not all the colours correspond, most colours don't correspond, but one or two key colours do correspond. So all these spot the differences I've shown you basically tell us that these copies were based on a very detailed drawing, but not the original painting. And I can't obviously talk to you about other studies we've done because we've done lots. We have other cases, for instance, the battle between Carnival and Lent, where every colour, every motif is identical. So in our opinion, Bruegel the Younger copied his father precisely when he knew what he had, so when he saw the original painting. But when he sometimes just had the drawings, he then invented the colours. There's an interesting one here, which actually I'll show you. You can notice that on these cloths that go over the mules, there's the double-headed eagle with the Toison d'Or, the golden fleece around it, and it's not in the original. So if we assume that Bruegel the Younger copied the model drawing faithfully, it looks like Bruegel the Elder has then decided not to include this feature in his final painting. But it is a feature we see in other Bruegel's painting. Here we are, in the sense of the Bethlehem, it's on the wall. So what is this feature? In fact, it's the insignia of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. In the context of a biblical scene, the double-headed eagle also refers to Herod, and not Herod, the Emperor Augustus, so the Roman emperor. But it has a double meaning when you see the golden fleece, because the golden fleece was a chivalrous order that was not obviously around in the time of Jesus. So this was a reference to the Holy Roman Empire. And why Bruegel dropped it from the adoration, we don't know. It may be at the behest of his client, the person who ordered it, who said, I don't want that political allusion. And as Dominique we were discussing this earlier, she says that sometimes for some in that day, Charles Quint was this hero figure, marvelous leader, and for others he was a tyrant, a despot. So it kind of depends who commissioned the painting, and we don't know who commissioned the painting, to perhaps why it was dropped. So just a final point, because we're not really talking about the copies today, but I think you're probably curious, how did Bruegel the Younger produce all these copies? Let's just start at the beginning. Oh. When you go, I'm just reminding you how it looks in infrared, the original, and I said to you, when you look at the copies underneath, they're incredibly detailed in terms of their underdrawing. So all those dark lines you see there on these two copies are underdrawing. And as you see, they almost fall in the same places as well. And why is this? It's because they were based on a sort of semi-mechanical method of reproduction. And for this method, Bruegel the Younger would have had to have made a cartoon. And I will show you a little bit the process. So he takes his oak plank. The ground layer gets put on, several layers. Between each layer, it's rubbed down with horsetail, which is a natural abrasive. Then you've got your imprimatura, which is this priming layer to seal the ground. And then the cartoon is made. So what we think is that Bruegel the Elder had his model drawing. It was inherited by Bruegel the Younger. We don't think that he directly took that and pricked through the holes. We think that he made a new model drawing of his own, pricked along all the lines to make a cartoon, which is a prick cartoon. And then he would have pounced, what we call pounced, the design through this cartoon using black pigment. And then he would take it off and he would join up the dots with black chalk. And that's how he did it. And doing that process, joining up the dots, doing everything, is not that difficult. And that's why I've got a little demonstration at the back there to show you how straightforward it was. Then you'd wipe off these dots, which are actually just loose powder, loose black powder, using a pigeon wing or using a rough rag. And that is the result you get. And we see 500 years later, we can spot it. In this particular series, I've never seen any the dots that remain, but in the battle between Carnival and Lent, there's an area of the painting where these dots still survive. Presumably they were stuck into the imprimatura for some reason, but mostly they would just be wiped away because they would have sullied and dirtied the paint layer had he left them. So that was just a little aside on the copies, but thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions.
Thank you very much. I think it was one of the questions I heard the most often, like, how are you really sure that you are owning the original?
Oh, really?
And I tried to answer, but I didn't. I couldn't as good a job as you did. Thank you very much.
Well, it's not an easy question, really, when you've got the eye, and then it's nice to, some people they want more than just stylistic proof, they want the scientific proof as well, don't they?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's nice that we have in the exhibition that we can really show the copy next to the original, and then it's so obvious, especially when you, for example, look at the ice hole. I mean, the differences are...
it's very stiff, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very stiff. And